Welcome back. We're going to, after having had our review of the movements, we're going to dive right into 20th century Western art, which spans the years between 1900 and 1980. Okay, so this is going to be symbols for the videos that we can access on Khan Academy. Um, this symbol is on YouTube Smart History or Kenny Mencher, which is another individual that produces a lot of videos, and then the Khan Academy articles. Okay, the works that we're going to look at, and I will not take the time to look at because you have this on your PowerPoints, begins with Le Demoiselle d'Avignon, and on this slide it ends with 141, The Migration of the Negro. And then we start with The Jungle by Wilfredo Lamb, and we end with The House in Newcastle County by Ventura, Roche, and Brown. Okay, and we're just gonna get right into it. Now, if you look over here, we've already talked about Les Demoiselles, we talked about the Kandinsky, the Kirchner, Villa Savoy, the Mondrian. We did not look at the Stepanova, but we looked at the works of a similar work by Rodchenko. We looked at Falling Water, the two Fridas, the Jacob Lawrence. So, in other words, we have now had a review of the works through the movements, and now we're going to take a deeper dive. So, what are the enduring understandings? What are we really looking at when we are examining this broad spectrum of art history? So we've seen that art is influenced by changes in society. Sigmund Freud, that was the very famous and important psychiatrist, and his theories on sex, and then Albert Einstein. So these are figures that have been born into a society that is now breaking with all the norms that have been accepted up until this time. So Europeans and Americans are gaining a better understanding of worldwide culture because now the world is just beginning to become more global. Artists are becoming more prominent members of society. It used to be that early artists wouldn't even sign their work. And as time progressed, that became a thing where people signed their work. In Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, we see that he signed his work and put himself in it to say, hey, we're a very important part of society. So I'm giving you that as an example of how artists were not considered a professional or something that should be admired. So we have modern movements that include Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, which is what we just reviewed. The advent of women artists. In many societies, women have not had, to put it mildly, a leading role in politics, in art, in society. And within this time frame, many countries began a little shift, and women artists became more recognized around the world. Artists published manifestos. A manifesto is a belief system, so they published what they thought was something important that they needed to proclaim. Artists and architects used new materials such as acrylic, earthworks, cantilevers. I had a discussion on the differences between the oil that was used before and then the acrylic now. Earthworks were works such as the spiral jetty that we saw, and the cantilevers on Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. So now we see art in a more provocative way. that is addressing the public. So we see commercial galleries. What's a commercial gallery? So a gallery is generally explicitly used in presenting works of art, an art gallery. Could there be another type of gallery? Possibly, but generally it's a word used exclusively within the field of art. So you had commercial galleries, meaning that you would go to a place, look at art, and be able to purchase the art. That's commerce, commercial. So museums open and display art. Now you have this as something commonplace. More and more you had collectors that had a lot of money to be able to collect very famous works, and then they donated them to a museum, or as in the case of the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia, they were very wealthy patrons of the arts, and when they died, they left the home to be preserved as a museum, and that was another way of displaying art. So we started seeing the sale of art to a widening market. More and more people were able to acquire works of art by artists, not necessarily an artist of great renown, because you would have to be a billionaire or a multi-millionaire, but you had artists who were creating original works and then possibly making lithographs of it, and so you paid thousands maybe for an original and then hundreds for a lithograph, so it became more available to the public at large. Artists worked for private and public institutions, and sometimes to a critical public. So what do we mean by a critical public? So when you are creating a critical analysis of something, it doesn't necessarily imply that you're going to criticize it, but you're going to analyze it and expound on it. Let's look at the 20th century historical background. Okay, what are the major events? Remember that we've spoken about how the fact that art always has to take into account the context. People are always painting something that is alluding to what is currently happening or addressing a reaction to a previous art period that they either liked or didn't like. So what were the major events? World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Great Depressions, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, and then technological advances in general. Museums became popular and public places. The patrons hired the finest architects to construct the space and showcase the art. Some of the most beautiful books you could ever find are actually books that have not just the artwork, but the museum itself, how the museum started, the construction of the museum. And my husband, being an architect who you met, Jim, that is something that is just fascinating, because let's take an example. The Louvre in Paris, France, used to be a palace for the kings, right? And here we had to go back to the example of the Barnes. They turned this very wealthy doctor's home into a museum. So this became a very popular thing for people to want to share their artwork, people that were very wealthy to share their artwork. Another example comes to my mind. In New York City, there's the Neue Gallery that has a tremendous collection of German expressionistic art, and as I said, the owner is the heir to the Estée Lauder fortune. She's a woman that made her fortune in cosmetics. You may be familiar with the cosmetics and perfumes of Estee Lauder. So patrons of museum hire the best architects. Why? Because they've put so much of themselves. And since I taught you both the psychology of art along with the art history, you will recall that if you love art, it affects your brain, it affects your body, it affects your nervous system, it affects everything, and it's like a drug. So this is why they wanted the best of the best to design a place to house their works. Okay, let's look at the beginnings of what we call modern art. So it becomes a reaction to the horrors of the modern world, which starts with World War I. We have a transformation of art styles. They move away from realistic, remember Courbet, realism, and more on abstract, remember Helen Frankenthaler and Rothko. The audience reactions. So what did people think about what they were doing? They went, huh? Mostly negative. American audiences were reviled and appalled by works because they were so opposite to what they were used to seeing. Okay, reviled is like you're disgusted, you're like you want to vomit, and appalled is you're like shocked beyond belief. So reviled and appalled, shocked. Okay, so I reviewed with you on the previous slides, on the previous presentation, based on the slides rather, that the art capital had been Paris for the longest time, right? So now we have the art capital of the world moving from Paris, France to New York in the USA. Why? Because after World War II, what happened? There were so many areas of Europe that had been compromised or devastated because of the war, and many American artists were starting to experiment with new ways of exploring the world of art. So we have an exhibition in 1913, the Armory Show, to introduce Americans to the current trends in European art. So who were these contemporary artists? Picasso, Duchamp, and other American artists that we will look at as well. The audience's reaction was not positive. The show featured highly controversial art. Okay, starting with abstract art. So this is what is known as art that is in the purest form, opposed to realistic. Again, think Courbet, think of Olympia, which in realism you had like the gravitas of life, people with the daily grind of living, right? So now they're saying no more oil on canvas, too basic. Instead, let's do frottage, collage, what look to people like children's art, like they're like, huh, I could do that. So they're deriving inspiration from the African culture. Before it was considered primitive, and the Europeans and the Americans were like, no. But remember when we looked at the Picasso, and I said, look at this fang mask. In fact, if you wait for me for 1 second, I'm going to show you a fang mask. Do you remember the Picassos? When we go into our deep dive into Picasso, you're going to see this look. So this is a fang mask, and this is what was called primitive. Okay, ready-mades. This was an already existing object, selected and exhibited as a work of art. Think of the urinal in the fountain. Okay, so let's look at the different genres or themes in art. You can have historical. This is a historical narrative. It could be something major from an event in history. Maybe a portraiture of a king or queen in the event of doing something. Religious could be a religious narrative. The ones that we had seen were based in Christian or pagan roots. Christians where the people that believed in the historical figure of the man Jesus Christ, born to a Virgin Mary, and whose father was God, and he came to die on a cross for the sins of the world. And so in ancient times, until just a couple hundred years ago, most of the works that we saw were religious. So then the portraiture, it's a formal depiction of a patron, typically idealized while still capturing the subject's likeness. So let's take Augustus of Prima Porta. Although that is not a portrait, it's a sculpture, it still is a good example for me to explain to you what idealized is. Idealized means that they have taken a person and they have made them look better and look younger. And if they had any flaw, that flaw was amended and corrected. So in Augustus of Prima Porta, whenever Augustus was painted, even though he was in his 60s, they made him look like he was in his 20s or 30s. And he always had a little curl in the front. He always was very buff and very built and very athletic, and he always had a power figure. And so that's idealized. Now, that is as opposed to veristic or realistic. You also had and he was a figure in Roman times. You also had the total opposite, or antithesis, in Roman times, called the sculptures that were either called veristic or realistic. And this showed figures which had all of the creases from being older, and if they were bald, it showed them balding, and it was completely different from idealized. On the contrary, they wanted to show the flaws and emphasize them. Okay, next we have genre or genre. Depict scenes of everyday life. They're informal. It could contain something allegorical or contemporary or historical issues. Okay, so a genre, that word can be used in two different ways. The way that it is being used here is to show an everyday scene. What were the events that they used for everyday scenes? One of the most famous of the genre painters was Johann Vermeer. And he usually had women in front of a window by a light, the light streaming in, and they were either reading a letter. There's one called Woman with Letter, or holding a balance, where behind her was a Last Judgment scene, and that was also called vanitas. Well, and that's in still life, but this is in this category as well, that they're taking this genre scene and then they're instilling a moral value in it. And you see that in the still life also. Okay, in landscape, you have scenery like Mont Saint-Victoire, valleys, trees, rivers, and it could, not always, it says usually contains a higher meaning. It could, but not necessarily. And then the still life or inanimate objects. Now, we have an artist by the name of Rachel Roque. And Rachel Roque had still lifes that had lizards and birds' eggs. It had wheat, sheaves of wheat. It had wine, not wine per se, but they would juxtapose the grapes for the wine along with the wheat for the Eucharist that the Catholics celebrate. And so what I told you here for the genre and the vanitas, this term applies to both. And what it's saying is life is but a vapor. Life is very transient. You can't be thinking always of the jewelry and the nice clothes and the nice TV and computer, but you also have to think of life after this. Let's take a look at Fauvism, or the Fauves. Okay, a movement that started in 1905, developed in France, and it's the first new artistic style of the 20th century. talked about it before, that it was pure, vivid color. Look at the orange of the goldfish. Look at the vibrant green. We had the wild beasts that they were called, and Matisse. We looked at these two images already, and now there's going to be a little overlap as we looked at the movements in general. Now that we're into the specifics, some we've covered, some we haven't. So if we've covered it, I'm going to just go over it lightly. So this is also from Matisse's oeuvre, and the oeuvre, remember, is a French word for meaning the inventory of works of this artist. So here we have the goldfish by Matisse, and he was a French artist. This particular work we find in the museum in Moscow. Okay, and the Calme and Volupté, and the Joie de Vivre, or Joy of Life. This is in New York City, and this is at the Barnes Foundation that I've mentioned to you before. So we've just in this short amount of time, we've seen Matisse with several works that have goldfish. And this was a special exhibition called the Red Studio that we were able to go see in New York City at the MoMA Museum, which is the Museum of Modern Art. And we see here how he has taken different works of art and put them into a room where he painted. Okay, so very, very interesting. This whole concept was like a collage, right? Okay, so these are other Matisse works. This is one of his most famous. It's called Woman with a Hat from 1905. Now let's look at Cubism. So here we have the Picasso, and again, remember I showed you the picture of the hand of the fang sculpture. Look at this. Look at this. Check out the woman at the very top right, the woman over here, even the woman here. So he collected African art, and he used that art to incorporate into his Cubist work. Okay, so it's an extension of the formal ideas that Cézanne began, who was the father of Cubism. It goes deeper than what you see on the surface, because what he's doing is he's fusing multiple perspectives and moments in time. Draws attention to the flatness of the canvas itself. Okay, now The Kiss by Constantin Brancusi. Okay, and he's a Romanian sculptor, and created this particular abstract sculpture. And look at the arms, how they twist and turn, and it's an embrace. We see that this is the woman, because you see the body shaped with a breast. This is the man, and what he wanted was to have it so that you knew that this was a couple embracing, but that was the extent of it. He didn't want to go beyond that. Okay, and then this is in the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim is one of the great museums of our country. And this is Brancusi at this museum. So we see all of his different works. And then this looks very much like the Dada. Why? Because it is. You see this right here, so they've combined a little bit of both. Okay, and here we have The Kiss again. Le Demoiselle d'Avignon, and Cubism. Let's watch a video on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso.
We're on the 5th floor of the Museum of Modern Art looking at Demoiselle d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso.
Picasso is a Spanish artist, but he's in Paris when he paints this. The title translates to The Young Ladies of Avignon,
which refers to a street that's not in France, but is in Barcelona. and associated with prostitution. What we're looking at is a brothel. The idea of rendering a woman who is available to the male viewer, but within a context that goes back to Degas, but it also goes back to Manet, if you think about his painting Olympia. And you could go even further back to the Venetian Renaissance and look at paintings by Titian.
For many art historians, this painting is seen as a break with the 500 years of European painting that begins with the Renaissance.
And many art historians see this as the foundation on which Cubism is built.
So it's this radical break that points to the future. And it's a radical break with these conventions of representation that had for so long been accepted in the West about how you make a body in space, how you create a space. All of that is upended by the Demoiselles d'Avignon.
Gone is linear perspective. Gone is chiaroscuro, that modulation of light and shadow that creates the illusion that Picasso, by the way, was in love with, the magic of illusion. But here he's shattering it.
He found the formal means to convey the ideas, I think, that were behind Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, ideas about sexuality, about the female nude, about sexually transmitted diseases. This is a confrontational painting.
In the original sketches, the women were focusing on a male that was included, a sailor. He was also a medical student. But he takes those men out, and the women then turn their gaze outward, like Manet's Olympia, to engage us, the viewer, directly.
Those two male figures give us a clue to some of the ideas behind the painting. A sailor, someone who's in a brothel as a customer, who was seated at a table originally.
And then the medical student takes on a more analytical view, who looks at the women from a more scientific perspective, but also maybe from a more artistic perspective. Artists have a history of dissecting human bodies, of understanding the bone structure, the musculature, of looking at the body analytically.
But let's not forget that that medical student carried, at least in some sketches, a skull. And of course it makes sense that a medical student studying anatomy might be carrying something related to his profession to tell us who he is. On the other hand, the skull in art history is a reminder of death. It's a memento mori. And so there seems to be some tension here between the sensuality that the sailor is indulging in and a moralizing reminder that the pleasures of life are short, indicated by the skull carried by the medical student.
The faces of the women on the right are often seen as representations of African masks that we know Picasso was then looking at. The figure on the left is an archaic figure going back to ancient Spain, going back to Iberian art before the classical period.
That's one of the problems of this painting. We look at art and we expect stylistic coherence, but here we have this agglomeration of styles.
It's a kind of invention. Picasso is allowing his laboratory to be exposed to us. There is a physical confrontation. There is danger here.
The figures are really close to us. Space has become this palpable three-dimensional fractured planes.
The curtains that seem to thread in between the figures are pressed right up against those figures. There is no space behind or between. There is still some sense of illusion. There's still some shadow. There's still some highlighting. But Picasso has only created an illusion that goes back into space a few inches. It's a little bit difficult to look at this painting without the hindsight of understanding where Cubism is going to go. But knowing that Cubism is this deconstruction of three-dimensional form, shattering that form, and then placing those fragments back on a two-dimensional surface has led some art historians to look at the central figure as one that we're both looking across at, but also looking down at, as if we're standing over her while she lies on a bed. These were not ideas that Picasso came up with independently. Matisse had been exploring these ideas, and before him, Cezanne had done this.
You can see why artists who saw this painting in Picasso's studio soon after it was painted were horrified. Even Degas, when he represented unidealized women in a brothel, never came close to the rawness, the ugliness.
Picasso is a product of his culture. He's a product of this moment. The fact that he's looking at African masks in order to represent danger is an expression of France's colonialism. Those objects, those masks, were coming to France because France had large colonial possessions in Africa. And Picasso at this time knew very little about the cultures that these came from. He He was interested in them for their formal qualities, for their formal inventiveness, also because they represented otherness.
This idea of needing to go outside the Western tradition in order to express what the early 20th century and the late 19th century felt like is important. This tendency toward expressing the flatness of the picture plane, not denying it by creating this false illusion. This is a very important thing in the late 19th and early 20th century.
It speaks to the oppressiveness with which post-Renaissance culture, mannerism, the Baroque, neoclassicism, the academies of the 19th century, all weighed on contemporary artists who are seeking a new visual language to represent modern culture.
Okay, so here we have Les Demoiselles d'Avignon again, and Les Demoiselles is generally on display at the MoMA in New York City. Okay, so Cubism. This is also a very famous work by Pablo Picasso, and it's called Guernica. This is a painting that was to show the horrors of war again, and when the town of Guernica in northern Spain was bombed, and the effects on the people. Here we see a horse and people laying around dead or dying, a child that's dead. The cow is a symbol, one of the symbols of Spain. So this work is at the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Okay. Then The Portuguese Man by George Braque, another example of Cubism. And all of his works had the same tones and the same color scheme. You really have to look very carefully and look at the titles to kind of try to put together in your head what the actual illusion is of. Okay, so now we're moving into a totally different aspect of art. It's called photosecession avant-garde photography, and again, avant-garde is on the cutting edge, something that's brand new. Okay, and here we have The Steerage by Alfred Stieglitz, and this is photosecession avant-garde. And so Alfred Stieglitz was married and went on a boat tour with his wife, and he was a photographer, an artist, and very kind of laid back, didn't like to have like a lot of attention, and was very sensitive to the plight of poor people. So he had come out of his cabin and took a look at the scene in front of him, and here we have this ramp, and we have the poor people at the bottom wearing shawls. Then we had this man with a hat on a higher deck, and he said, oh my goodness, I need to run back, because he saw this incline ladder making a type of horizontal diagonal type line, and he saw the roundness of the hat and all of these images here, and he says, I have to be able to capture it. And he did, and this is one of the most famous photographs in history. Okay, now you can find this image at the MoMA, and because it is a photograph, you can also find it at other local museums that exhibit it. Now, German Expressionism, 1914. So remember, this is around the time of World War I. And we've already looked at this before. The two groups, the Die Brücke, or the bridge, and then Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider. So it was influenced by Romanticism and symbolism, and it wanted to express the emotions. Okay, so this piece is also one that this piece, meaning the slide, we've also looked at before, so I'm going to move on right into, the actual work that we're gonna look at. So it's a self-portrait as a soldier by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. He's a German expressionist. I wanna say he would be the most renowned one. It was oil on canvas. Acrylic has been a more modern material that has been used, and there was no attempt to have a physical or realistic representation, rather. And so here we see that we have Kirchner having himself as a self-portrait. Now, he had tried to, when going to war, he had a lot of mental health issues. He tried not to be at the battle lines because he was scared, and he wanted to continue to live. He wanted to continue to paint, and so he painted himself with this part of the hand missing, because he felt like he had been denied the power of being able to express himself through this medium. And it was because at the time that he was painting, already there was a movement to censor different artists for different reasons, particularly if it had a political undertone or overtone. Here's an Ernst Kirchner at the Guggenheim, and this is a street scene. Other Kirchners at the Guggenheim. And so last summer, or the summer before, I can't remember now. No, I think it was last summer, we went to Europe, and in Austria we saw a German expressionism exhibition. And actually, there were two. These pictures are from, there was a grouping that had very similar works to this in our trip to Austria, and then there was this one that I saw at the National Gallery of Art when I was getting my visa to China, that we visited the museums there. So now, going back to Der Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Rider, and Vasily Kandinsky. And here's his piece. You have Improvisation 28, and Vasily Kandinsky had this work, which is his iconic work, and there is so much going on. And he also had a condition where when he saw art, he heard art. And so we're going to watch a video that's going to expound on this.
We're at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City. We're looking at a painting by Vasily Kandinsky. This is Improvisation number 28, second version. It's interesting to start off by thinking about that title, because it's not the title of something that's being represented. It's the kind of notation that a composer uses.
Right, normally in art history we have paintings with titles of stories from the Bible, or from history, or from mythology, or landscapes that have the name of a place. But here we have improvisation, which is the name of a kind of musical composition. So the immediate question is, why is Kandinsky doing that?
Well, because he's composing here. He's composing with form, but this is still rooted in the stories of the Bible and of his particular historical moment.
But he's clearly trying to associate painting with music, to suggest that, like music, painting can signify, it can mean things, it can take us places without representing anything concrete.
Actually, he would go further than that and say that you could hear color, that you could see music. This idea, which is called synesthesia, is something that Kandinsky was very interested in, the idea that there could be a kind of crossing of the senses.
So looking at this, he may have wanted us to actually hear something. And in fact, we know that Kandinsky was very influenced by Arnold Schoenberg, a turn-of-the-century composer, who was jettisoning the familiar Western harmonies to create a new kind of difficult atonal music for the beginning of the 20th century. And I see something atonal, I see something difficult here.
What would this painting sound like? For me, it would sound like a cacophony. It would sound like chaos. It would sound like a very dangerous, but also brilliant moment.
We have brilliant color, a kind of hazy atmosphere through which that color pops. We have these black diagonal lines that crisscross with each other that almost feel like weapons moving through space.
And it's appropriate that the analogy that you're drawing is one of war. This is 1912. It's just 2 years before the First World War begins, and early 20th century Russian history is filled with political chaos.
We're clearly on the verge of abstraction, and in fact, when we first look at this painting, it looks entirely abstract. That is, we don't immediately recognize the things of the world. But this isn't what we would call a completely abstract painting.
Right, so one might not call this painting an abstract painting, but call it an abstracted painting.
So therefore, we should still be able to recognize some elements of the natural world.
Kandinsky was concerned that if we could recognize things too clearly, that our conscious minds would take over the interpretation, and we would close off our emotional ability to respond to the pure color and form.
On the upper right, I seem to see a mountain with some buildings on it, maybe with chimney stacks, or perhaps a church on a hill. An ideal city, a kind of heavenly Jerusalem.
Kandinsky was deeply influenced by biblical imagery, and so even though this is a tremendously modern painting, it is still rooted in this ancient tradition of representing Christian stories.
So it makes sense that we have a battlefield, forces at war.
In fact, art historians have looked at these paintings as a kind of representation of an apocalypse, of a moment when the sins of the world are going to be washed away. In the lower left, you have a great flood, you have a wave, this idea of the way in which God in the Old Testament had wiped man from the earth except for Noah and his family.
Just above that wave, cannon were being fired. The atmospheric effect almost reads like the smoke on a battlefield.
Down at the bottom, art historians sometimes recognize the manes and the arcs of the necks of horses, and we know that Kandinsky was really interested throughout his career in the idea of the horse and rider, symbolizing a number of different things, having overlapping meanings, referencing the horsemen of the apocalypse, but also the idea of redemption. This was also utopian, the idea that we could wash away the old world, a world that was about to be destroyed not only by the Russian Revolution, but also by the First World War. Kandinsky at this moment was convinced that he could help lead that, at least in the visual realm.
Many artists at this time, the early 20th century, had a sense that the artist could play an important role in the new civilization that was going to emerge in the 20th century.
So here we have a painting that is using color in a radically new way. This is color for its own sake, not to mimic, not to describe. We have line that is being used for its own sake, lines that is abstractly moving across the surface to create a sense of rhythm, to create a sense of staccato, musicality in this painting. It is absolutely new.
So I hope that the video on Vasily Kandinsky opened up your eyes to what the artist was trying to convey. He wanted you to get the idea of something apocalyptic. We saw the word synesthesia and how it's a connection of the senses between your sight and the sound. And he was very much influenced by religious paintings from the past. Vasily Kandinsky was featured in an exhibition in the Guggenheim Museum a few years back that I was privileged to attend. And so they had, I want to say, 3 floors of the Guggenheim Museum. This is the piece that we studied, the improvisation piece, but they had all his oeuvre from the very beginning to the end. They had a huge collection of his work, and his inventory is extraordinary. So these are other images of Kandinsky's work. Now we're going to go to New Objectivity with Kathy Kollwitz in the 20s. So this was a reaction against Germany's German Expressionism during the 20s. It was considered post-expressionism, and artists who originally had art during the late expressionism movement focused on an objective view. I had talked to you previously when we had this slide as an overview that when something is objective, you're looking at it from the perspective of, I'm going to be neutral. I'm going to take a look at this without letting my feelings get involved. But here, what they were doing is they wanted something that was not subjective, not your feelings involved, but something that you could touch and feel, something tangible, a tangible reality. And so here we have the memorial to Carl Liebknecht by Kathe Kollwitz. It's New Objectivity. It's a woodcut. And so Carl Liebknecht was a communist leader that had recently been assassinated, and Kathe became a communist at one point in her life after her son had died in a war. And this was a memorial similar to the images you have of Christ with the Pieta. And this is the first time that we see a woodcut, and a woodcut has a process that you use wherein you take a piece of wood and you carve it depending on how much ink you want to put on the wood, so that it becomes either lighter or darker in its rendition. You can make multiple images. And so this was a memorial, something to commemorate the death of Carl Liebknecht. And we're gonna see some more images. She had a lot, in addition to the Carl Liebknecht, she had some self-portraits, mother and child. Here's another mother and child, because since this is a recurring theme with her due to the fact that she had lost one of her children. You can see that her art is very sad and forlorn. Here you have a mother mourning over a child. And this is in the National Gallery of Art that had that exhibition that I was mentioning to you. Okay, so next time that we meet, we will continue with the Dada movement. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time.